Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today we're going to be talking about Dark Knight in Shadowbringers, the OG tank that I actually learned how to tank on back in Heavensward, for the simple reason that it started at level 30 and the other two tanks that were available back then started at level 1. Now, outside of just being the first tank that I learned to play back in Heavensward, it was actually my favorite tank during the Heavensward days as well, and it actually filled the role that Gunbreaker has for me right now. Whenever I want to try a little bit more, I play Gunbreaker. Whenever I want to chill, I play Warrior. And back in the Heavensward days, that was exactly what I did with Dark Knight. Whenever I wanted to put some more effort into my play, I would play Dark Knight. If I wanted to chill, I would play Warrior. Now, going into Stormblood, they kind of butchers the job for me personally. The whole mana management aspect of Dark Knight became pretty brain dead with Dark Arts, which back then was your major mana spender, would cost less mana and basically also be consumed on many more abilities that you had access to, meaning that mana management didn't really feel as intricate as it did back in Heavensward. They also cut one of the combos and made that specific GCD in an off-global cooldown, which also made it so that Dark Knight now only has one combo, which again I didn't really like all that much, and it just felt too much like a Dark Arts spammy bot than anything else. I still played it a fair amount because I didn't really like Stormblood Paladin all that much, so I basically mained Warrior and then played Dark Knight whenever there was already a Warrior in the party, but I wasn't a very big fan of it. Now, going into Shadowbringers, they reworked the job yet again. Delirium also changed again to where it is right now, basically a cheaper version of Warriors in the release, which I'm really not a fan of. But I'll talk about that when we get there. But I do think that the current Dark Knight playstyle is quite alright. Still kind of unfortunate that there's only one combo that we have access to, but everything else does fit really well together, and it still has a relatively active playstyle as well, because Dark Knight has a fair amount of off-global cooldowns to press. It is still a more chill tank to play because we only have one combo, so you can pretty much just autopilot through your GCDs, but you still have a lot of other aspects that you have to be thinking about, all of these off-global cooldowns. There's still the mana management. We now have a blood gauge that we have to manage as well, together with a Darkside gauge, which is our damage buff. So there's basically a lot of things that you still have to manage, so even though the combo aspect and like the GCDs you basically don't really have to think about all that much, there is still a lot of other things that you will have to think about when playing Dark Knight, which still make it relatively fun to play. Now, where the real fun of Dark Knight comes in for me is its mitigation style. When it comes down to mitigating damage, I believe that Dark Knight is the best tank in the game, period. I really enjoy Warrior's mitigation style, where it is all about healing themselves back up, but when it comes down to Dark Knight, it is all about preventing that damage, and it's really good in doing so, especially when it is about doing magic damage, because Dark Knight is the magic damage tank, and we have a very potent defensive ability for that is also on a very short cooldown, so we can basically use it for every single tank buster that will be coming at us, given of course that it is a magical tank buster, because this does not work on physical stuff. But of course, even if we can't make usage of our Dark Mind, which is what the ability is called, we still have plenty of other things that we can use to deal with physical tank busters. So let's talk about the mitigation first, then we'll go over what the gauges mean, and then we'll just go into everything else that you need to know about Dark Knight. So first of all, mitigation. Rampart 20% damage mitigation, as all the tanks have access to that. Shadow Wall is our 30% mitigation. Again, every single tank has access to this. But then when it comes down to the unique things to Dark Knight, we have Dark Mind. As I mentioned before, this is our magical damage mitigation on a 1 minute cooldown, meaning that you're going to be able to use this pretty much on every tank buster. And it's also 20% magic mitigation, which is quite strong. Now, of course, I do know that layering multiple pieces of mitigation on top of each other has diminishing returns, but still being able to layer, like for example, a Dark Mind on top of a Rampart, on top of a TBN, which I'll talk about in just a second, is just a crazy amount of mitigation, and certain tank busters will literally hit you for less damage than certain auto attacks would, which is really satisfying to see. Then Living Dead is our ultimate cooldown. This one is a little bit of a double-edged sword. It is really user-friendly in terms of using it yourself as a tank, because you have a lot of leeway in how you can use it, because what it does is it will give you the Living Dead buff for 10 seconds, and if you die during this 10-second period, you are given the Walking Dead buff, or debuff technically, which again lasts 10 seconds, and if this debuff was to run out and you are not healed for your full HP, you die. So that's kind of unfortunate, but if you are healed for your maximum HP, 100% of your HP, then you are basically staying alive. Now, the reason why this is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time is because it's really user friendly. You have a 10-second period to to use this before you were supposed to die to a tank buster that you were gonna take without cooldowns, or a tank buster that you were going to cheese, for example. But then on the other hand, once you are inside this Walking Dead status, that is where your healers need to invest a lot of healing tools to basically make it so that you won't die. If you have a white mage, then you don't have to care about this at all because you just benediction and you're fine. But if you don't have a white mage in the party, then some healing tools will have to be invested to make sure that you don't die. So Living Dead, it's really great for what it does. It's really user friendly. It's a very long lasting defensive cooldown as well. Just a little bit annoying for your healers if there is not a white mage in the party. Now moving on to the Blackest Knight, aka TBN is what I'm going to be calling it for the most part of this video. This thing is what makes Dark Knight so incredibly strong when it comes down to preventing damage, because this thing will grant you a 25% maximum HP shield. It's on a 15-second cooldown, meaning that you can use it more often than the other tanks' spammable cooldowns. It is also stronger than all of the other tanks' spammable cooldowns, but there is a caveat to it, and it is the fact that it costs 3000 mana. Now this number is really important, because all of your other mana spending abilities will also cost you 3000 mana. And these other abilities will deal damage, and this thing is a mitigation cooldown. Now, the cool thing about this is, if this TBN shield that you create for yourself breaks, you're given a Dark Arts, which will then translate into damage later. Talk about that later as well. So it is basically a double-edged sword. You can use TBN for the mitigation, just to pop it on cooldown if you want to do so, but if your shield doesn't break, it's a damage loss. Basically, you want to try to use TBN in instances where you know that the shield is going to break, which will basically be most tank busters in the game. Well, pretty much any tank buster in the game, really. But for example, when it comes down to mitigating auto attacks, you might not want to do that necessarily, because if your shield doesn't break, you're going to be losing damage. If the shield does break, then of course you are granted your damage back in the form of basically a mana refund, which is kind of how that works. So if you were to compare it to the other tanks, they can use their mitigation cooldowns without there being a downside to it, but I do feel like it is kind of justified because of how incredibly strong the Blackest Knight is, because it's 25% HP shield, meaning that it basically just mitigates a lot of damage, which is why it is kind of justified that there is the caveat of, if the shield doesn't break, you're not granted the damage refund that you just lost by using the TBN. So that's why I'm okay with that. And last but not least, we have Dark Missionary. This is our party utility tool. 10% magic mitigation for 15 seconds on a 90-second cooldown. Basically the exact same thing as what Gunbreaker has. Pretty good cooldown to use, just use it whenever there is some raid-wide AoE. Then moving on to our gauge, we have three different things that we have to talk about here, which is the blood gauge, the dark side, as well as the dark arts. Now blood gauge is really simple. We have a few ways to generate blood gauge through using GCDs. We have a way to generate blood gauge through using an off-global cooldown, which I'll talk about those things later. Basically, whenever you reach 50 on your gauge, you can use Blood Spiller, Quietus, or Living Shadow. All of your skills cost 50 gauge, and you can go up to a total of 100 gauge. Basically giving you a lot of leeway to use those abilities. Blood Spiller is your single target GCD, Quietus is your AoE GCD, and Living Shadow is an off-global cooldown. Both Blood Spiller and Quietus are just spammable. You can use them as much as you want as long as you have the gauge for it, whereas Living Shadow is on a cooldown, so basically you always want to make sure you use Living Shadow first and then spend the rest of your gauge on Blood Spiller or Quietus depending on the situation. Then Darkside, this is our damage buff that we have to manage. Now this also ties in together with our mana management, because the two abilities that we use to keep this buff up, called Flood of Shadow for AoE and Edge of Shadow for single target, are going to be costing 3000 mana. Again, there's that 3000 mana number that I was talking about before. So basically Flood of Shadow, Edge of Shadow, these are two off-global cooldowns. They consume 3000 mana, so as long as you have 3000 mana, you can use these abilities, and when you use them, they grant you 30-second worth of Darkside, stacking up to a total of 60 seconds. So generally, as long as you have full uptime on a fight, you should not be able to drop this buff even if you tried, so as long as you're not letting your mana overcap, this basically should never drop. The only instance that I can really think about where you would drop Darkside is probably Shiva Savage, because the downtime there during the cutscene is so incredibly long. But outside of that, you should basically always be able to keep your Darkside up, because of course it also grants you damage. Now the last thing we need to talk about for our gauge is our Dark Arts, and this is what we got from our Blackest Knight. Whenever the shield breaks, you are granted a Dark Arts. Now of course, if you already have a Dark Arts, you can't get a second one, so you do need to make sure that you expend this one before you use TBN again. Now when the TBN breaks, you're granted the Dark Arts, and the Dark Arts is basically going to flash a button on your gauge, and then whenever this is active, your next Flood of Shadow or Edge of Shadow is not going to cost mana. So it's basically going to be refunding you the mana cost of TBN, thus making it so that you stay DPS neutral by using TBN. So if you use TBN, the shield doesn't break, it's a DPS loss. If the shield of TBN does break, you're granted a Dark Arts, and a Dark Arts will make it so that the next Edge of Shadow or Flood of Shadow is not going to be costing you any mana. So pretty good way to handle like basically TBN giving you some damage back. I do know that some people preferred the old way that TBN worked back in Stormblood, where it would just give you 50 blood gauge, which was really cool, how you could manipulate your GCDs into a fight to make it so that you would end a specific boss phase on your Soul Eater combo. But we can't do that anymore, unfortunately enough. It is basically just a damage neutral thing now when your TBN shield breaks. Moving on to our combo. This one is going to be a quick one because, as I mentioned, Dark Knight only has one combo. It's a 1-2-3. The second hit in the combo regenerates mana for you. The last hit gives you 20 blood gauge. Also regens a little bit of HP, but that's something that most tanks have at this point. So nothing too special about here. Just a 1-2-3 combo. You can interrupt this combo to do Blood Spillers, Quietus, that kind of stuff. You can also use it together with Delirium, which I'll talk about at the end of the video. Which is basically the cheap in-release of Warrior. You can use this mid-combo, and you can just continue onwards after that, giving you have enough skill speed to do so. So yeah, that's basically the combo. 1-2-3, mana, blood gauge, that's pretty much it. And then the last thing we have to talk about are some off-global cooldowns that we have missed. First of all, Blood Weapon. This is a buff that works a little bit annoying at the moment, because when you have it active, you're going to be granted 10 blood gauge every time that you use a GCD, and every GCD is also going to be regenerating mana for you. Now this is a 10-second duration buff, meaning that you want to use it as late as possible into your GCD, because otherwise you're not going to be able to fit 5 GCDs under this effect. So this is kind of annoying to play with, because of course you want to be doing the exact same with your Delirium, that you want to use this at the end of your GCD, like your off-global cooldown window basically. Because otherwise you're not going to be able to fit the 5 abilities inside that Delirium window, and with Blood Weapon it's the exact same thing. If they were to ever change this, I hope they would give it the Bunshin treatment that Ninja has gotten, where it basically just gives you 5 stacks, and then the next 5 GCDs that you use will utilize those 5 stacks. I think that would make it a lot more user-friendly with how the Dark Knight playstyle is. And for example, people that have issues with ping, with latency, or for example, that don't know you should be using it in the second part of your GCD, like recast timer. So that's something that I would like to see change. Outside of that, Blood Weapon, great skill. It gives you blood gauge, it gives you mana. Both of those things will translate into damage, so pretty cool thing to use. Salted Earth is basically the reverse Asylum. Asylum of White Mage will heal everyone that is standing in it. Salted Earth is a bubble that you place down and will deal damage to all the enemies that enter it. And that's basically all it does, just a puddle that deals damage as long as it is there. Plunge is our gap closer. This one stacks up to 2 times, like most do for the other tanks as well. It also deals damage, so you can just use this for damage during burst windows. You can save this for movement when you need to. Basically up to you how you want to use this one. Abyssal Drain is a really great skill to use in dungeons, because it's an AoE lifesteal effect. Of course, on a boss, this will just deal some damage, lifesteal a little bit, but when you're doing dungeon pulls, it is usually worth it to let yourself drop a little bit before using this, because it does lifesteal a fair amount. Outside of that, it's just an off-global cooldown that you want to be pressing on cooldown as much as possible. Carven Spit is another way for us to get mana back. This is an off-global cooldown that will just deal a bunch of damage, but it will also regenerate some mana for us. Of course, we want mana to use more Edge of Shadows or to get back to using that TBN. And then last but not least, we have Delirium, the budget version of Inner Release. And this is one of the reasons why I'm kind of conflicted with Dark Knight at the moment, as I feel like they're kind of shoving it towards being a warrior again as well. Like Bloodspiller is basically Fellcleave, Quietus is basically Decimate, and Delirium is a cheaper version of Inner Release. And that's kind of why I'm a little bit conflicted about my feelings about Dark Knight, because it kind of feels like a warrior, even though all of the other things that I just explained make it not feel like warrior at all. I feel like they just kind of stole these tools from warrior, which I don't really like that much, and I really hope to see Delirium change, because I had the privilege of playing Heavensward Dark Knight, and I knew how cool it could be. Now, of course, the old Delirium would not fit in the current Dark Knight, but I would hope that this changes going into the next expansion, because basically I just find it to be a little bit of lazy job design to literally copy paste a mechanic from one job onto the other. Now, what it does is, as I said, basically a worse version of Inner Release. Whilst Delirium is active, you can use your blood gauge abilities without using mana. Now we can only use Bloodspiller and Quietus, or GCDs. We can't use Living Shadow for free, so it's a little bit worse again in that aspect compared to Inner Release. Now outside of being able to use Bloodspiller and Quietus for free for these 10 seconds, which would basically translate to 5 usages of one of these two skills, it will also generate some MP for you every time that you hit a GCD during this Delirium window. So that's pretty much how Delirium works. You just press the button, again, late into your off-global cooldown window, and then you're going to be doing 5 Bloodspillers or 5 Quietuses. I don't even think that's a word, but basically you're going to be using one of those skills 5 times during this Delirium window, dealing a pretty decent amount of damage, also regenerating mana every time that you hit a GCD. And that is pretty much going to be that. You can use it mid-combo, just like with Inner Release, but of course it's kind of up to you where you want to use it. Basically just try to use it on cooldown as much as possible. So that is the current Dark Knight. I think its playstyle, even though I would personally prefer to see it changed a little bit, especially Delirium, I'm very conflicted about, because Warrior has been my main for the majority of Stormblood, which is why I don't really like them just copy pasting the mechanic or the ability onto Dark Knight and just make it worse. Outside of that, I do think that the Dark Knight playstyle is pretty fun. There are a lot of different things that you have to manage. You have a lot of off-global cooldowns, both when it comes down to dealing damage as well as mitigating damage. Then of course, you have the blood gauge you have to manage, you have your mana management, that dies into your Darkside management as well, which in my opinion is still a pretty fun playstyle. And then of course, when it comes down to its defensive mitigation, Dark Knight is just a rock that is able to mitigate just so much, which is incredibly fun as well. So that's pretty much Dark Knight. If you have any more questions about it, or if you want to share your own thoughts on Dark Knight, feel free to leave them in the comments down below. But that's gonna be it for me. I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.